Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. When the wind blows a certain way, I can smell the gunpowder of Omaha Beach again. My name is Mchenry, and even after half a century, every grain of sand from that beach on June 6, 1944 remains alive in my memories. Time may have softened some of the scars, but the echoes of that morning have never been completely silenced. I was a soldier in the 29th Infantry Division, part of the first wave of the assault on Omaha Beach. At the age of 22, like many other young Americans, I hardly knew what awaited me. Our mission seemed clear: on paper, land on the French coast and establish a beachhead. The reality would be very different. The dawn began with the nauseating rocking of the landing craft. The sea was rough, and many of us were already seasick before the fighting even began. Sergeant Miller, our platoon leader, was trying to keep morale high, but his voice trembled slightly as he gave us our last instructions. "Stick together and keep going," he repeated. "Don't stop for anything." Words that would soon become painfully meaningful. Next to us was Johnny Martinez, my best friend since basic training. His hands were shaking as he held his M1 Garand rifle. "We'll make it, Tom," he muttered, more to himself than to me. The roar of the ship's engines was occasionally interrupted by the distant sound of naval artillery shelling German positions. As we got closer to the coast, the sound of battle became more intense. The explosions of the naval bombs mingled with the noise of the German coastal batteries. When the ramp of our vessel lowered, all hell broke loose. A wall of fire greeted us. The German machine guns strategically positioned in the bunkers swept the beach with deadly precision. The water around us boiled with the impact of the projectiles. "Move, move," shouted Sergeant Miller's last order before being hit. I saw men falling all around me before they could even get out of the water. The weight of the equipment was pulling us down, turning every step into a fight for survival. Johnny was just ahead of me when we reached the water. Our training told us to keep our distance from each other, but fear kept us close. Tank obstacles and mines hidden in the sand created a deadly labyrinth that we had to cross. The beach was littered with craters caused by the bombings, which offered some precarious protection. I threw myself into one of them along with 3 other soldiers I didn't know. The sound of bullets whizzing over our heads was constant, mixed with shouts of order and cries for help. "We need to advance," shouted one of the soldiers in the crater. It was Corporal Wilson. I recognized his badge. "If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks when the tide comes in." Between the intervals of enemy fire, we could see the German bunkers at the top of the cliffs. They seemed impregnable, spitting death nonstop. Our naval artillery had failed to neutralize them, and now we were paying the price. I saw Johnny try to advance a few meters to my right. He managed to reach a twisted iron obstacle using it as cover. We made eye contact briefly, and he signaled that we should try to advance together to the next position. The chaos around us was indescribable. Medics were running around, risking their lives to save the wounded. Officers tried to reorganize the scattered units, but the confusion was total. The beach was becoming a graveyard of men and equipment. Between the explosions and machine gun bursts, I could hear different languages and accents. The 29th Division was a mixture of Americans from all corners of the country. There were farm boys from Kansas, workers from Detroit, students from Boston, all united at that crucial moment in history. Time seemed to drag on. Every second was an eternity of decisions between life and death. The smell of sea salt mixed with the acrid odor of gunpowder, and something else I'd rather not describe. The sand on the beach, once golden, was now stained red. At that moment, I realized that our mission was no longer about military objectives or glory. It was about survival. It was about staying alive for one more minute, one more second, and trying to help our comrades do the same. The waves kept bringing more men and equipment onto the beach. Some amphibious vehicles managed to operate, providing some fire support against the German positions, but most sank or were destroyed before reaching the shore. The deafening sound of battle created a macabre symphony that I will never forget. It was the sound of history being written in blood on the sand of Omaha Beach, and that was just the beginning of our longest day. As we took shelter in that crater, I realized that Johnny was right. We needed to move forward. The tide was rising fast, and that depression in the sand would soon become our tomb if we didn't move. The German fire was still intense, but we were beginning to see a pattern in the machine gun bursts. On my count, I shouted to the other soldiers in the crater. I watched the rhythm of the enemy fire, carefully waiting for a breakthrough. When the burst subsided, we made the desperate sprint to the next cover, a damaged Sherman vehicle about 20 meters ahead. Corporal Wilson didn't make it. I watched as he stumbled in the middle of the road, his helmet rolling in the sand. I tried to get back to help him, but Johnny held me back. "You can't do anything for him now," he shouted, his voice almost disappearing amid the chaos of the battle. Our unit was completely dispersed. I saw isolated groups of soldiers from the 29th trying to reorganize themselves at different points on the beach. One officer was trying to coordinate an attack on one of the bunkers using a Bangalore grenade launcher, but they needed cover. "We need to support that group," Johnny pointed to the men with the Bangalore. It was our best chance of breaking through the German defenses. I nodded in agreement, and we started providing covering fire with our M1 Garands. The noise was deafening. The German MG-42s were firing hundreds of rounds a minute, creating a continuous and terrifying noise. Mixed in with this, mortar and artillery explosions shook the entire beach. Sand flew in all directions, making it even more difficult to see. Between bursts of gunfire, I could hear shouts of order in German coming from the bunkers. They were coordinated, disciplined, defending every inch of that beach with deadly precision. Our training had prepared us for a lot, but nothing like this. A group of Rangers began climbing the cliffs to our right. They were determined men, using ropes and hooks to try and outflank the German positions. Watching them gave me hope. If they made it to the top, they could neutralize some of the machine gun nests. Martinez and I continued to provide cover for the Bangalore team. Every shot had a count. Our ammunition wasn't infinite. Sweat ran down my face, mixed with salt water and gunpowder. My arms ached from the constant recoil of the rifle. "Bangalore ready," someone shouted. It was our chance. The explosion of the device opened a gap in the barbed wire. Immediately, several soldiers began to converge on that point. It was the moment we needed, an opening to get off that damned beach. But the Germans noticed too. The intensity of the fire increased dramatically in that area. I saw men falling as they tried to cross the gap. Still, some managed to get through, establishing a small position beyond the first line of defense. A medic ran past us carrying his equipment bags. "I need cover," he shouted. Without hesitation, Johnny and I positioned ourselves, protecting his advance to a nearby group of wounded. It was the kind of courage I saw all the time that day, men risking everything to save their comrades. The hours dragged on. The sun began to rise in the sky, but the smoke from the explosions created an ominous haze over the beach. Ships kept pouring in more troops and equipment. Some made it, others were destroyed before they even lowered their ramps. A Sherman tank finally made it across the beach, offering crucial support with its 75mm cannon. Seeing that war machine advancing gave us a new lease of life. Little by little, more tanks arrived, creating support points for our infantry. Johnny found a pair of binoculars among the wreckage. With it, we were able to get a better look at the enemy positions. The bunkers were real concrete fortresses with firing sectors overlapping each other, covering every meter of the beach. We realized that our initial bombardment had completely failed to neutralize them. "We need to join that group," Johnny pointed to a platoon that was reorganizing about 50 meters to our left. They were men from our company, and they were planning a coordinated assault on one of the smaller bunkers. The decision to cross that open space was terrifying but necessary. We couldn't remain isolated. We waited for the right moment when a group of P-47 bombers flew by to attack the German positions, providing a few precious seconds of distraction. "Now," I shouted, and we began our desperate race. The weight of the equipment seemed to triple, and each step was an eternity. The sound of bullets cutting through the air around us was constant, but we kept going, driven by the sheer instinct of survival. Those 50 meters were the longest of my life. When we finally reached the group, I realized I was holding my breath. Johnny arrived soon after, panting, but alive. We joined the other soldiers preparing for the next move. The battle was far from over, but something had changed. Slowly, meter by meter, we were advancing. The price was high, terribly high, but the determination on the faces of the survivors showed that we would not give up. Omaha Beach would be conquered no matter what the cost. The sun was already high when we got a more favorable position near the base of the cliffs. The group we had found was led by Lieutenant Patterson, a young but competent officer who was reorganizing the survivors for a coordinated attack. "Mchenry, you and Martinez know that sector well," said Patterson, pointing to the area where we were previously. "We need information on the weak points of that side bunker." He was right. After hours of observing the German positions, we had a good idea of their firing patterns. We shared our observations with the group. The bunker had a blind spot on the right flank where the terrain formed a slight slope. If we could position a team with explosives there, we'd have a chance of neutralizing it. The Rangers we saw climbing earlier had made significant progress. Some had already reached high positions and were beginning to make a difference, eliminating German snipers and creating distractions. Every small gain gave us more hope. "We need volunteers," announced Patterson. Johnny and I immediately volunteered along with 3 other soldiers. Our mission was simple on paper. We were to approach the bunker from the blind spot while the rest of the group provided suppressive fire. One of the volunteers was Frank O'Brien, an experienced demolition worker from Chicago. He carried the explosive charges we needed. The other 2 were the Anderson brothers from Montana, known for their exceptional rifle marksmanship. We began our advance by taking advantage of every available cover. The terrain was marked by craters and debris, which we used to move undetected. The noise of battle was still deafening, but we had learned to filter out the important sounds. The smoke from the fighting gave us some additional cover. We moved forward methodically, stopping only to check that we hadn't been detected. Every meter gained was a victory, every move a deadly dance with fate. The youngest of the Andersons, Robert, stepped on something metallic. We all froze. It was an anti-personnel mine, which by some miracle didn't detonate. Sweat poured down his face as he slowly withdrew his foot. Seconds that seemed like hours passed before we were safe again. We arrived at the plan point. O'Brien began preparing the charges while we stood guard. From our position, we could hear the voices of the Germans inside the bunker. They were men like us, following orders, defending a position. War had such ironies. Johnny signaled movement above. More Rangers had reached positions on the cliffs. They began a coordinated attack against other German defense points, dividing their attention. This was our chance. O'Brien finished positioning the explosives. Now came the most dangerous part. We needed to get far enough away before detonation. The way back was exposed, and we would only have seconds before the Germans realized our presence. "Ready," whispered O'Brien, holding up the detonator. Everyone nodded. There was no need for words. Each man knew his role. The timing had to be perfect. The signal was given. As we retreated, our support group stepped up the suppression fire. The Germans responded, but their bursts were less precise, now divided between multiple targets. The explosion was tremendous. The bunker wasn't completely destroyed, but it suffered significant damage. More importantly, the explosion created confusion among the defenders. It was the moment so many had been waiting for since the start of the landing. "Forward!" the cry echoed across the beach. Groups of soldiers began to move towards the German positions. Resistance was still strong, but now we had momentum. The determination on the men's faces was visible. No one would accept being stuck on that beach any longer. I saw Johnny smiling for the first time that day. It was a tired smile, but genuine. We had achieved something that had seemed impossible just hours before. But the battle was far from over, and we still had a lot of ground to gain. More tanks arrived on the beach, providing crucial support. Doctors continued their heroic work, saving lives under intense fire. The Allied war machine was finally starting to function as planned. Patterson reconvened the group. Our success had come at a price. Of the 5 who had taken part in the attack on the bunker, only 3 had returned. The Anderson brothers had stayed behind, 2 more names on that day's endless list of heroes. The battle for Omaha Beach would go down in history as one of the most crucial moments of the war. But at that moment, we weren't thinking about history. We were thinking only of the next objective, the next bunker, the next hill to be taken. The conquest of the bunker was only the beginning of a new phase in the battle. With a gap established in the German defenses, more troops began to converge on our position. Lieutenant Patterson quickly organized a defensive perimeter while we planned our next move. "We have information that there is an artillery battery behind that ridge," Patterson pointed to a hill about 300 meters from our position. It's punishing the troops still landing on the beach. We need to neutralize it. Johnny and I looked at each other knowing that we would be volunteering again. It was no longer about heroism or bravery. It was about protecting our comrades who were still fighting to get off that damn beach. O'Brien, our demolition expert, checked his remaining equipment. A group of Rangers joined us, bringing valuable information about the disposition of the German forces on top of the hill. They were men from the 2nd Battalion, led by Sergeant Reynolds, a veteran of the campaign in North Africa. The Germans are reorganizing their defenses, Reynolds explained. They've lost several key points in the last few minutes. This is our chance to put the pressure on. His experience in urban combat would be crucial for what was to come. We began our ascent by taking advantage of the natural cover of the terrain. The Germans had dug trenches and defensive positions all over the hillside, but many were now abandoned or occupied by disorganized troops. Each step brought us closer to the objective, but also increased the risk of detection. The sound of the battle on the beach still echoed, but now it was different. More tanks had made it through, and their heavy fire support was making a difference. P-47 planes continued their attacks, keeping constant pressure on enemy positions. "Movement ahead," whispered Johnny, pointing to a partially covered trench. A group of German soldiers were trying to establish a new defensive line. They were young men, probably from the regular Wehrmacht, not the SS units we were expecting to meet. Reynolds organized a coordinated attack. We split into 3 groups, one to flank another to provide suppressive fire, and our demolition team to approach the artillery battery. Precision would be crucial. We couldn't alert the enemy's main positions. The attack was quick and efficient. The Germans, surprised and isolated, soon surrendered. There were 8 men, most of them wounded. One of them, who spoke broken English, reported that his officers had withdrawn to secondary positions, leaving them behind. "They know they've lost the beach," Reynolds translated. "Now, they're trying to delay our advance as long as possible." It was a tactic we knew well, sacrificing smaller units to buy time for an organized retreat. We continued advancing now with more urgency. The artillery battery was still active, its shells wreaking havoc on the beach below. The terrain was getting steeper, and the fatigue of hours of combat was beginning to take its toll. O'Brien prepared the explosive charges while we set up a defensive perimeter. The artillery position was well defended, but we noticed a flaw in their security system. They were so focused on protecting the front sector that they left their flank vulnerable. 3 minutes is all I need," said O'Brien, checking his detonators. Johnny and I positioned ourselves to cover him, along with 2 experienced Rangers. The tension was palpable. We knew we wouldn't get a second chance. The attack began with a burst of suppression fire from the Rangers positioned on the hillside. The initial confusion gave us the precious seconds O'Brien needed. He moved like a shadow between the German positions, planting explosives at strategic points. The enemy resistance was fierce but disorganized. With no officers to coordinate the defense, their reactions were predictable. Even so, we lost one of the Rangers in the clash hit while providing cover for our retreat. The detonation was deafening. The artillery battery exploded in a series of secondary explosions as the stored ammunition hit. The sky darkened with smoke and debris, and for a moment the entire battlefield seemed to fall silent. Patterson quickly regrouped us. The destruction of the battery was a significant victory, but it also exposed us to counterattacks. We needed to consolidate our position before the Germans could reorganize. "Well done, men," said Patterson, his voice showing both relief and concern. "But this is only the beginning. We still have a lot of ground to gain." He was right. The battle for Omaha Beach was far from over, but now we had hope. I looked at Johnny, who was methodically cleaning his gun. His eyes were different, harder, more focused. The war was changing us minute by minute, action by action. We were no longer the same young men who had landed on that beach hours before. As we advanced inland, the battle changed in nature. The Germans had lost their fortified positions on the beach, but still maintained a considerable presence in the small villages and woods of Normandy. Each advance required caution and meticulous planning. Our unit, now a mixture of survivors from the 29th Division and Rangers, was ordered to clear a nearby village that served as a German command point. Johnny and I were assigned to the reconnaissance team, drawing on our recent experience in infiltration. Keep your distance from cover to cover, instructed Patterson, marking points on the makeshift map. The Germans should have snipers positioned on the belfries and rooftops. We don't want to lose anyone else today. The sun was beginning to set, providing longer shadows that we used as natural camouflage. The Norman countryside, usually peaceful with its hedges and orchards, had turned into a deadly labyrinth. Every hedge could hide a machine gun, every farm an enemy position. O'Brien remained with us, his skills with explosives still vital. They probably undermined the main roads, he commented, observing the terrain. We'll have to find alternative routes. His expertise in detecting booby traps had already saved several lives that day. We approached the village from the west, using a small stream as cover. The Norman houses, built with centuries-old stone, offered excellent defensive positions. Using binoculars, we spotted German movement. They were regular troops, but well-equipped and determined. 3 MG-42 that I can see, whispered Johnny, mentally mapping out the enemy positions. One in the belfry, 2 in the windows on the second floor of that stone house. His observation skills had become even sharper after the hours of combat on the beach. Patterson gathered the squadron leaders to plan the attack. We had the support of 2 Sherman tanks, but the village's narrow terrain limited their effectiveness. We would need to rely mainly on infantry for this job. We'll split into 3 groups, Patterson explained. One to pin down the enemy, another to flank from the north, and a smaller team to infiltrate and take out those machine guns. The plan was sound, but we all knew that the first few minutes would be crucial. Johnny and I volunteered again for the infiltration team. We knew each other's work well, now communicating almost without words. O'Brien joined us along with 2 Rangers experienced in urban combat. As dusk approached, we began our approach. The sounds of battle still echoed from the direction of the beach, but they seemed distant now, as if they belonged to another world. Our reality boiled down to that village and the mission ahead of us. We used the gardens and orchards as cover, moving silently between the trees. A dog started barking somewhere, making everyone freeze momentarily. 10 seconds passed before we confirmed that we had not been detected. First contact with the enemy was inevitable. A young German sentry almost stumbled into our position. Johnny silently neutralized him, another young life lost in that insane war. We took his papers and radio information that could be useful later. Our infiltration progressed methodically. O'Brien prepared silent charges, specially adapted for use in urban environments. The German machine guns would need to be eliminated simultaneously to prevent them from alerting each other. The Rangers positioned themselves to provide cover while Johnny and I approached the belfry. Every step was calculated, every movement mentally rehearsed before it was executed. The tension was palpable, like electricity in the air before a storm. The signal to attack came when the Shermans opened fire on positions on the outskirts of the village. The momentary confusion was all we needed. O'Brien's charges detonated in perfect sequence, eliminating the machine gun positions before they could react effectively. The planned chaos worked as expected. The Germans, losing their main defensive positions, began to retreat inland. Some tried to establish rearguard positions, but the momentum had definitely turned in our favor. "Don't let them regroup," shouted Patterson, coordinating the advance of the other teams. The village was systematically cleared, house by house, street by street. The training and experience acquired during the day showed its worth in every move. Night had already fallen when we finally secured the village. The silence that followed the fighting was almost surreal after a full day of incessant battles. I remember sitting on a partially destroyed wall, watching Johnny methodically clean his rifle, a ritual that had become familiar over the course of that endless day. Patterson gathered what was left of our unit for a quick assessment of the situation. Of our original force that landed on Omaha Beach, less than half were still in fighting condition. Every face present carried the weight of the experiences of the last few hours. "We've been ordered to hold this position until reinforcements arrive," said Patterson, his voice hoarse from shouting orders throughout the day. "The Germans still have considerable forces inland, and we need to prevent any attempt to counterattack on the beach." O'Brien organized teams to prepare the defenses. We used the wreckage and abandoned vehicles to create barricades on the main access routes. The Rangers took up positions on the high points, taking advantage of their experience on high ground. During that first night in Normandy, the distant sounds of combat never completely ceased. Occasional explosions lit up the horizon, reminding us that the battle continued elsewhere on the coast. The smell of gunpowder and smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of Norman orchards. Johnny and I shared the watch positioned in a partially destroyed house that offered a good view of the surrounding terrain. "It seems like forever since we got off that boat," he commented, breaking our usual silence. He was right. In just one day, we had had enough experiences to last a lifetime. Each of us had changed profoundly. The inexperienced young men, trembling with fear on the landing craft, had turned into battle-hardened veterans. During the early hours of the morning, we tried to record the names of our lost comrades. It was a painful but necessary task. Each name represented an interrupted story of family that would receive that terrible notification from the War Department. The Anderson brothers, Corporal Wilson, Sergeant Miller, the list seemed endless. At dawn on June 7th, the first reinforcements began to arrive. New units from the 29th Division, fresh and well-equipped, gradually took up our positions. I watched their young, determined faces, remembering how we looked just 24 hours ago. Patterson gathered our unit together one last time before we were relieved. "You made history yesterday," he said, his voice laden with restrained emotion. "Never forget what we've achieved here, and above all, never forget those who have fallen by the wayside." As we prepared our retreat to the reorganization area, I paused for one last time to observe the beach in the distance. The tide had washed away many of the signs of the battle, but the marks remained visible in the destroyed structures, the abandoned vehicles, and above all, the temporary crosses that were beginning to dot the landscape. Johnny put his hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture of understanding. We survived D-Day, but we knew that the war was far from over. We still had many battles ahead of us, crossing France and eventually entering Germany. "You know, Tom," said Johnny as we walked towards the regrouping area, "I don't think I'll ever see a beach the same way again." I didn't have to reply. I understood exactly what he meant. Years have passed since that fateful day, but the memories remain as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. Every time I hear the sound of waves breaking on the beach, my mind involuntarily returns to that June morning in 1944. Johnny survived the war and returned to Chicago, where he opened a small store. We kept in regular contact until his death in 1992. O'Brien continued in the Army, serving as a demolitions instructor until he retired. Patterson received the Silver Star for his leadership in Omaha Beach, but he never liked to talk about it. Today, when young people ask me about D-Day, I try to explain not only the historical facts, but also the spirit of sacrifice and determination that we witnessed that day. I talk about the men we lost, about the silent courage of the medics who risked their lives to save others, about the camaraderie forged under enemy fire. Omaha Beach is now a peaceful memorial visited by tourists and students trying to understand the events of that day. The German bunkers are still their silent witnesses to a battle that changed the course of history. But only those who were there can truly understand the human cost of that victory. This is my D-Day story, one account among thousands of others. Each survivor carries their own memories, their own invisible scars. I share this narrative not in search of glory or recognition, but to honor those who didn't come back to tell their stories.